What's going on, guys? Aarava here. Welcome back to another video for my Let's Talk F1 series. This is the year-long series where I get to talk about real-life Formula 1 across the season. Of course, this is for the 2016 season, and today's video specifically is about the World Champions car, the Mercedes W07 car. It has been launched today online. If you missed my earlier video today, that was on the Mclaren MP431, and also on Friday I did the Ferrari. Be sure to go check those out. But this video is about the reigning World Champions Mercedes and their new 2016 Challenger. So straight away, let me know what you guys think of the livery of the car and the general look of it. Let me know in the comments below as per usual. Do you like it, hate it, or do you think it's just kind of pretty much the same as last year's car? Let me know all that good stuff. And as you can see clearly already from this first picture, you can definitely see it's a big evolution of last year's car. And Paddy Lowe has already stated in an interview that this is pretty much a car that fixes a lot of the issues. Last year's car, although dominant, did have a few issues in terms of the cooling, and sometimes it was a car very much on edge. It was teetering on the line between it was going to have a fault or, a mechanical failure, and was perfectly fine. It was always on that edge. We've seen it on tracks like Bahrain where the Mercedes were managing their engine and their brakes, so this car aims to try and fix that. So if we look at the front end, specifically at the front wing, the nose is near enough, to me, literally identical to the 2015 car. Obviously, why would Mercedes change it? It was a winning formula. And when it comes to F1 design, you can't simply do a pick and mix in terms of putting a stubby nose front end on a car like the Mercedes. The entire car is really dictated by everything. Everything works together like a well-oiled machine. So Mercedes, obviously, they've gone with this philosophy, whereas Ferrari, McLaren, Williams last year went with the kind of stub nose philosophy. But this is a successful philosophy. It did work for them last year. Even Williams have said in interviews that their new 2016 car will have a nose that's style like this at Melbourne. Away from the nose tip, looking at the actual front wing itself, it's very much just the same as it was in Abu Dhabi. Maybe a few little differences here and there in terms of the wing angles themselves, but in terms of the elements, all very much the same as the Abu Dhabi. Usual sort of stuff, as I said so far in all these Let's Talk videos. A lot of the time cars will just launch with, the kind of same front wing as they ended the last season on, and then they develop. But actually, interestingly enough, Mercedes have said in interviews that this car that has launched is pretty much near enough to the one they will have at Melbourne. Mercedes has said the reason for this is because the two pre-season tests are back-to-back at Barcelona, and then there's only a 2-week gap to Melbourne. They've said because of that time frame, because there's only literally 2 weeks between the last test, and also the fact that two pre-season tests are back-to-back, they've cited that their engineers have been pushed hard to really create the car that's actually ready to race at Melbourne, rather than really a kind of raw prototype of a car that they'll really develop on before the season starts. And because of this, I think Mercedes is going to come out of the blocks running. I've said this a few times on Twitter already, but I think tomorrow, day one of the first test, Lewis Hamilton is piloting this car. I think he's going to do around 200 plus laps in this car day one. If you remember back to this time last year, 2015 preseason testing, day one, Nico Rosberg did 157 laps in their brand new 2015 car, and that was a car that changed quite a bit to their 2014 Challenger. The entire front end was very different, the philosophy around the rear end was different, and also the rear was different. But this year's car, as you can clearly see, is a big evolution, and they've already stated that it's going to be very much like the Melbourne spec car they're going to be racing with. So in light of that, I really think, unless they're going to sandbag and, do some sort of strategy of just looking at the data quite closely, I really think they'll go with the same strategy, go guns a-blazing, but this time they could get even more laps churned out in the first day. As we move up the car, I've circled on the left-hand side of this picture the leading edge of the side pod. There's a little node underneath the actual vortex generator. I'm guessing that node will purely be for aerodynamic purposes, because it's not really going to be anything that's going to be advantageous for the cooling inside, a la the radiators or anything like that. So that's purely going to be to affect the airflow in a positive manner. Also, it's going to be probably tied in with the actual interesting shape of the side pod, which you'll see later on in the video. Once we get a look at the side view of this car, you'll get what I mean. It's actually a new shape to the side pod at the leading edge of this side pod, and very much copying what Ferrari did last year. But then we move up to probably the most interesting feature of this car, which is a huge airbox there. Circled in green, you can see it's also got different compartments which will go to different chambers of the engine. This is very much along the same trend as Toro Rosso did last year. Toro Rosso, for the entirety of last year, if you look at pictures, you'll notice that it had a huge airbox, and that allowed the side pods to actually be very, very narrow and really get a great Coke bottle shape on the side pods. So it won't only improve cooling, because obviously there's more air going into this airbox, so you're going to have all the air that's going into the side pod inlets, and then also the cooling air that's going into this airbox. So there'll be be more air coming through there to cool the car, but also at the same time they can then theoretically move some parts around in the actual cooling system, the radiator and everything, the architecture of the engine basically, and they can kind of try to move it a little bit forward towards the front of the side pod theoretically, and they can try and slim down the rear, which is what could have happened. But actually, as we go on to a side picture, you'll see that the car really hasn't slimmed too much. You can see there I've outlined the actual side pod and the Coke bottle shape of the car. Now, although it does look pretty slim, I thought they would have slimmed it down even more. Unfortunately, Mercedes haven't released any overhead pictures. I really wish they could, so we could kind of do a comparison between the Mercedes, the McLaren, and then the Ferrari. But it looks to me from this side view at least that it isn't as slim as the McLaren or the Ferrari, which is surprising because I think that's a huge advantage of having such a big airbox. But as I did say at the beginning of the video, Paddy Lowe has stated that this car does fix a lot of issues that last year's car had, and one of them was sometimes being on the edge of temperatures, and this will very much fix that and make sure the engine stays efficient, stays cool, and will also improve the actual performance of it. Moving on to the end of the car, like McLaren and Ferrari, they've gone with the upside down Mickey Mouse strategy for the exhaust. I keep circling it because in theory teams don't have to follow this approach. They could do the two smaller wastegate pipes on top of the bigger one, so it could be an actual normal upright Mickey Mouse shape, or the upside down one, which most teams are going for. I'm guessing this will be advantageous in terms of the actual layout of the architecture of the engine, and also perhaps the plume coming out of the exhaust will be helped with having the wastegates at the bottom. We can look towards the floor of the car now, towards the rear tire. Mercedes have now got some little slot gaps in the floor, copying McLaren and Ferrari, and they've got some nice veins leading up to the tire edge, which will again create vortices to create a vacuum effect between the rear tire and the rear wing, and that will allow the diffuser to work a lot more efficiently. As last year on their rear wing, they've got these very subtle bulges, two bulges that go on from the Epson sign and one lower than that. They've had that pretty much for the entirety of last year, so they've kept that on, and they've also got the same strakes on the rear wing as well. Interestingly enough, if we move towards the front end of the car, if you pay attention to the actual mirrors of the car, you'll see that you can see a bit of a silver winglet coming up behind the actual wing mirror. Now, last year Mercedes had a similar winglet like this, which basically followed the shape of the actual wing mirror and allowed for a bit more of a kind of sidewall, if you will, where the air can kind of get pushed through, get attached to it, and get pushed the way they want it to. It looks like to me, from this picture at least, and comparisons with last year's launch car, that they've actually extended the height of this, and they've almost extended it to the height of the actual wing mirror itself. Moving to the top of the chassis, I've circled this kind of little kind of gap in the actual top of the chassis, just because it's an interesting topic to actually note that last year around Brazil, many people were hinting that maybe Mercedes could be developing an S-duct strategy, because of course McLaren have an S-duct, Ferrari are going to be debuting an S-duct, so Mercedes are one of the top teams that aren't really venturing into an S-duct strategy, and you would think with a very low nose this might be advantageous to them. So I've just circled that area. It could be a topic of conversation later on in the season if they do develop an S-duct. I think it probably would be advantageous to them, because to me at least, with a low nose, it would be advantageous to get air from underneath the car up to the top to clean up that dirty air. But at the same time, there's probably a reason they haven't done it so far. It probably doesn't fit in maybe with the philosophy of their car, or maybe they just don't feel like they need it, and maybe it will disrupt any kind of design elements they have with the suspension arms. Finally, if you can see on the left hand side of the picture, I've outlined the side pod, and if you can just kind of squint your eyes and look at it, you can see there's a clear stepped kind of motion to that side pod. It kind of starts off at the kind of middle part of the side pod, goes along and then swoops down, curves left like a backwards L, and then you've got that node that I described to you guys earlier at the front of the car. And if you remember to last year, this is very much like Ferrari's stepped side pod from last year. A little bit different. Mercedes have kind of stepped it down kind of forwards way instead of sideways, but it is sort of a stepped side pod at the leading edge of the side pod, something that I didn't think Mercedes would actually copy off Ferrari. And if we take a look at what Mercedes gave us yesterday on Saturday, they gave us this hyper-realistic drawing that Mercedes did for basically marketing and PR of their new car. If you look at it carefully and look at the outline I've drawn in green, you can see there clearly the step motion of the side pod. So that has been my analysis of the Mercedes W07. In conclusion, a big evolution of last year's car, fixing any flaws that it had last year, and that makes it a very mean car this year. I think even though the Mercedes hasn't changed too much, I still think it is going to be the force to beat this season, and we'll have to see how testing goes. Obviously, you know, everyone's sort of hoping that maybe Ferrari can battle Mercedes so we can have a championship fight, but I still think Mercedes have done an excellent job in this year's car. It's looking very aggressive. They've gone into detail, basically. They've refined the car in detail where it needs to. They haven't done any brash major changes to try and kind of gain too much from the car. They've refined the car that's already been a winning formula for 2 years now. So I think they're still going to be the team to beat, at least at the start of the season. So as usual, guys, smash that like button if you did enjoy the video. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. If you're new around here, then do subscribe for more car analysis videos. There's going to be a year-long series, Let's Talk F1. I'm going to be doing videos every single race weekend, so get subscribed if you're new around here, and I will be doing the Haas Formula 1 team later on today when they launch at 2 PM GMT time, so stay tuned for that. But guys, for this video, I hope you have enjoyed it. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day. I've been aarava, and I will see you guys next time.